All right, folks. Well, I have the honor of introducing our guest, Yves Winkin, and he's one of these folks who has so many accomplishments and prestigious visiting appointments in addition to regular appointments that I don't need to bother you with going through them all. But he comes to us by way of Belgium. I would call him an interdisciplinary social scientist, but perhaps you have to put a label, an anthropologist of communication. Also very known for his work on culture, particularly on enchantment. Also a student of urban life and pedestrian life in cities. More recently, he's turned to an interest in museum studies, and where some of our interests overlap. Very much interested in communication, interaction, gesture, and performance studies as well. He studied with Pierre Bourdieu before coming to the United States, where he studied with Erving Goffman, who he's going to talk about a bit today, as well as other luminaries like Ray Birdwhistle. And as is going to be the topic of his talk today, I think I said today he visited my graduate seminar, and I said that if he's not the most known biographer of Goffman, he's the most persistent, the most stalker-like, in a positive sense of the term, going to Goffman's former field sites, interviewing and archiving the notes of all of the people that Goffman interacted with, and reconstructing his social network. And so he's here today to talk a bit about a fragment of that work. And so with that, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the program.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I mean, everybody is going to count because it's a rather intimate seminar, but there might be more people watching and listening to us. So I might need to put those glasses on. The title of the talk might be a bit strange, and I'm not going to unravel it too fast. I'm slowly going to open it, but just be patient. So the title is, what do we do with Erving Goffman's habit of throwing the photographer out of the room? And that's going to be a talk about lecturing, reflexivity, and biographies. So first of all, thank you to Francois Nudelman and Courtney Rutherford for setting up this talk. Thank you to Colin Derlmack for the invitation to come to NYU. And thank you to Richard Schechner and Gary Jaworski to be in the audience. I feel very honored. So let me start with a few it happens. That is links or elements that are going to be linked together and ultimately produce what Colin just mentioned, that is a biography, very long in the making. It happened that, and we are in 76, that I got a fellowship to go and do a master's degree in communication at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. I wanted to work with Erving Goffman already, although I barely knew more than one or two of his books. 6 or 7 of his books are going to be translated in the 70s, thanks to Pierre Bourdieu, who had a series at the Édition de Minuit, and who decided that Goffman was worth translating almost entirely, or Goffman's work, I mean. It also happened that I attended Pierre Bourdieu's seminar in 75, 76, as I was completing my undergraduate degree in communication at the University of Liège. And after his last seminar, I went to him and told him that I was going to Penn, to the University of Pennsylvania. And he suggested that I call Erving Goffman in his name, use my name and tell Goffman that. So I dare call Goffman. I remember the hot summer of 76 as I arrived on the campus. And surprisingly, he was very nice to me. He invited me home and asked me what I wanted to do. And he let me attend his seminar whenever I wanted. Now, it happened that his seminar was conflicting exactly with Ray Birdwhistle's seminar, Tuesday at 9 o'clock. maybe the two of them were sort of competing for graduate student. So you had to choose either Goffman or Birtles. And I decided to attend Birtles' class instead of Goffman's, which might retrospectively sound surprising. You know, when you get the chance to listen to Goffman every week, why would you go and listen to Birtles? But it happened that I got so fascinated with Birtles that I could not decide to leave him and go to Goffman's class. Instead, I stuck with Birtles, and finally, I will do my master's degree under his supervision. And when I returned to Europe in '78, I still was so fascinated that I wanted to introduce him and his work to French-speaking audiences. I thought he deserved to be better known. Well, it happened that the only person who knew Birtles' work, apparently, at the time in France, was Julia Kristeva, because she had written a paper on gestures in a linguistic journal, Langage. So almost naively, but you know, naivete can bring you pretty far when you think about it, I decided to write to Kristeva, who very nicely wrote back and said, well, I cannot do much for you, but I suggest you go and see the French editor at Le Seuil called François Val. François Val, but I will only learn it later, was also the editor of Jacques Lacan or Roland Barthes and other luminaries, but all right. And the day I called, it happened that François Val was not in his office, but his young associate, Jean-Luc Géribon, was in his office, and he took the phone. It happened that Jean-Luc Géribon was just back from Yale, because he had been sent to Yale as a lecturer from the École Normale Supérieure of Rue d'Ulm, and he was just back, and under or at the recommendation of Jacques Lacan, whom he had met at Yale, he was introduced to François Val, who hired Jean-Luc. And Jean-Luc and I became friends over the years. It happened at the time, we are in early '79, I believe, that Jean-Luc Géribon was in search of a manuscript that would frame the up-and-coming Palo Alto school. The École de Palo Alto, the Palo Alto school, is not that very well known in the United States. It's not that much of a label, but it was much so in the late '70s and will be even more so in the '80s. It was a so-called school around people like Bateson or Paul Václavic and others. And it was some kind of a competing school vis-a-vis psychoanalysis, saying that you are not here to scrutinize the past of the patient. We are trying to reconstitute the circle, and especially his family circle, in order to see in what capacity he is standing within this circle of signifying others, or whatever the title, or whatever the term. So Jean-Luc Géribon said, okay, I'll give you an orange light in order to build up an intellectual mapping around the Palo Alto school. Tell me where that comes from. We just, at the time, there was only what was called a logique de la communication. In French, in English, that was pragmatics of communication. And it just came out of the blue, got published, it got successful, but nobody knew exactly who were all those people that Václavic and his colleagues were mentioning in their book. So I went back to the United States. I got interviews with Paul Václavic, but I decided that I was going to present two schools, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, and trying to show that both of those schools belong to the same invisible college. That is, Birtles worked with Albert Schefflin worked with Don Jackson worked with Gregory Bateson. So you cannot understand Bateson and the Mental Research Institute if you don't understand Birdwhistle and Shefflin and Goffman and other people. So I tried to do a much wider mapping than expected by the Seuil, but ultimately I got a book which was published in May 1981 called La Nouvelle Communication, the New Communication. And it happened that the book picked up. It was, sorry to say that, but a surprising success for the time. So, and finally coming to Goffman, Géribon invited me to consider a second book. Because at the time, at Le Seuil, if you had one book, then you could have a second one, possibly a third one. There was some kind of an idea of building up a team of writers in the social sciences, but not too fast. So at that time then, I suggested a model I had seen in the United States. I don't know whether you still use that expression, portable book. That is, I remember using a portable Veblen, for example, or a portable whomever. It was the idea that if you needed to know everything about Veblen or whomever, you needed an introduction, you needed a few papers, you needed bibliography, possibly a few comments, but you had it all in one book. So I thought, well, why not try to build a book around Goffman, which would have an introduction, and then a selection of papers by Goffman, and possibly an interview by Goffman because I had one, and bibliography, sure enough. At the time, as I told you, Goffman was being translated year after year by Bourdieu's team, but for some reason I never understood that had not provided any background. Here was the book, and now take care. So I suggested that model to Géribon, who accepted it. And then it happened that Goffman died suddenly in November 1982, almost exactly 22 years ago. I waited for a while, and then in 93, I was Fulbright at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and it happens that they also had a visitor there named Hans Mauch, not that well known of a sociologist, but it happened that he got a Chicago training in sociology at the same time as Goffman. So he knew Goffman, and he knew the entire network of friends and colleagues around whom Goffman had spent his years, that is 46 to, let's say, 51 or 52, in Chicago. So I started to interview him, and from him, I started to interview many and more people. Now, there was a problem. I went to Gillian Sankoff, who was the widow of Erving Goffman, and she immediately told me that she was not going to help me. She thought that Erving only wanted his work to be interpreted through his work. He didn't want any biographical interpretation, so she did not hamper me. She never called anybody to say, don't talk to Winkin. So that's nice of her. On the other hand, she never allowed me to interview her, and she never let me have access to Goffman's own archives. That's it. So I had to work in a different way. And so I decided that I would go to, as Colin mentioned, to every site which had had some importance for Goffman. Of course, the village where he spent his youth, nearby Winnipeg. Then I would spend some time in Chicago. Then I would spend some time in Berkeley, we're back to that, etc., etc. I tried to spend times in the casinos where Goffman did spend time. I also went to the island in the Shetland where he spent time for his PhD. That was his first major piece of fieldwork. I also got the chance to spend time, only one day, but that's enough to get an impression of it, in St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He spent almost a year acting as the director of athletic activities at St. Elizabeth's Hospital near Washington, Bethesda. So that was for me important to not act as if I was Goffman, but at least get an idea of where he spent time. Then it also happened that Bourdieu sent me in 1987 for one semester in the Department of Sociology at University of California, Berkeley. As you know, Goffman, after he graduated from Chicago, took a job at Berkeley around 1959, after his time at St. Elizabeth. And it happens that he spent about 10 years there before moving to the University of Pennsylvania. Many of his colleagues of the 60s were still there in the 80s. And I could interview them at length there on campus. That was easy enough. And that was probably the major campaign of data collecting that I did in the 80s. So finally, I was able to publish the first book with a long introduction, biographical introduction, a selection of papers, an interview, and the biography, a portable Goffman called, and I have it here because it's now published in a pocketbook version, Les Moments et leurs hommes. And I was able, and I just passed it around, almost as an ironic comment, I suggested that cover, which is nice because, as you know, Goffman referred to the metaphor of the theater, and you see mask. It's actually a painting by a Belgian painter called Hassan Foss. Of course, you have a lady in the nude on the cover, which is also a way of les moments et leurs hommes, was some kind of a way of alluding to the genre of those men and their moments. Anyway, or moments and their men, rather. And then I just don't know what happened. For the next 34 years, I tried to complete the biography I had started to publish in 1988. It happened that in that 1988 biography, I stopped when Goffman is finally mature, start publishing his first papers in his early 30s. But I said, all right, I don't need to go further because the very mechanic or the very structure of his mind is ready to produce the rest of his work. What was important was to set up his habitus, whatever you want to call it, and then we can let it go. It was a trick. I mean, it just happened that the publisher wanted the manuscript by that month in 1980, early 1988, and would not let me go on. So I just wrapped it up and said, it's enough, we don't need more. But for the next 34 years, I got frustrated because I didn't have, in a sense, the second part of his life, the second part of the biography. And then you might ask, why did that happen? How come I was so blocked in my efforts to finish up that biography? Well, there are many excuses, you know, you're teaching, blah, 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 you know, you're in the middle of your career, whatever. But let me just try to suggest three, quote unquote, intellectual explanations. One is that I was still under the spell of Pierre Bourdieu. And as you know, Bourdieu had a vision of scientific activities as systematically conflicting. He had that idea of what he called the intellectual or the scientific field. And in French, and I will try to translate it, a scientific field is always defined as a lutte pour l'imposition du monopole de la vérité, a fight for the imposition of the monopoly of the truth, in this regard, the truth of scientific truths. So within the scientific field and within the field of sociology, I was supposed to see how Goffman was either crushed or crushing colleagues fighting for imposing their worldview, so to speak. And I couldn't do it. And I remember, you know, Howie Becker, who was one of my major informants, saying, come on, Yves, you know, stop thinking the United States as if you were in centralized France. It does not work that way. The people on the West Coast don't care about the East Coast and vice versa. So you can, and the West Coast is not really competing with the East Coast. But I was so obsessed with Bourdieu, or my mind was so framed through Bourdieu theories of competition that I had a hard time thinking otherwise. One explanation. The other explanation for my resistance, so to speak, to keep working was a paper published by Bourdieu, here it is again, in 1987, if I'm correct, called The Biographical Illusion. And in that paper, which is very harsh, he says, life histories are literally bullshit. I mean, they are very naive, that those people doing history of life or life histories believe that lives unfold very quietly in a very straightforward way, while we all know that lives are, again, battles, circumstances, incidents, bumps, whatever. So, in other words, that's my word, not Bourdieu's, but I think I don't betray his vision. Let's not romanticize lives. We have to see them as, and that's a very strange image at times, we have to see lives as trolleys in a subway map. And if you want to write a biography, you first have to map out the subway map. And once you have the chart and the different routes that are possible, then you can put the trolleys and follow the life. In other words, his idea was that there were forces or determinants or whatever you want to call them that were much superior and much more causal than the life in itself. It's Bourdieu's. Today, it might sound strange to speak in such deterministic words, but at the time, it was very much the vision I was trying to enforce upon Goffman. And that blocked me because really I could not describe the entire subway map. It is as if I would have needed to write what is sometimes called a prosopography. That is, you take all the sociologists of the University of Chicago Department of Sociology, and then you start chatting where they went. I did that. I have unfolding maps where I try to see where is Becker, where is Strauss, where is, and where is Goffman in that chart? And it leads nowhere. You cannot complete a biography when you try to do almost 10, if not 100 biographies at the same time, because there were many graduates in the late 40s and early 50s at the University of Chicago. The third block had to do with, and not Bourdieu for once, but with my fight against the explanation of influences. I found that too many intellectual biographies were written as influences embedded into one another. And I thought it's too easy. You cannot always call it you rescue the very term influence. You can stuff so much under the rug with that term influence that if we want to have a very proper biography, scientifically speaking, we have to get rid of so-called causal influences, either influences from other people, influences from readings, influences from, I don't know, going to Paris and being flabbergasted by the Parisian atmosphere or whatever. Well, then, I had put so many conditions before resuming my writing of the second part of the biography that I was lost, in a sense. And one way I found in order to respond to those objections I was doing against myself and against traditional biographies, I started to write only small pieces. For example, the very early years of Erving Goffman. And within that paper, on the very early years of Erving Goffman, I would work through little tidbits, little verbal photographs, so to speak. At that time, I called them snapshots, and I had not discovered yet the very term biography, which means that I was not at all under the spell of Roland Barthes, who actually created that term biography in order to speak of meaningful fragments, which were for Roland Barthes and later for people who were influenced by Roland Barthes' vision of what is alive. There were little elements that would tell a lot, that were like synagogue, right? You use them and it's some kind of illuminating, the very small fragment is going to illuminate an entire section of one's life or your biography's life. So finally, 2022 came over, and that was the year of Goffman's birthday. He was born in 1922. So 100 years later, there was a lot of publishing activity in Germany, in Great Britain, in France, wherever, in order to celebrate his birth. And I resumed work through a small book called Erving à Goffman, titled Une œuvre performée. That is that a performed work? And let me explain my approach here. That slim book is some kind of a bet on one single paper that Goffman wrote in '76 and delivered as a lecture in 1977 at the University of Michigan. And that paper is called The Lecture. So he's going to talk in a lecture about what is a lecture all about. Speaking of reflexivity, we are now there. He's not as if he was saying, look what I'm doing. He's very stern, and the paper we got is not much of a fun paper. It's almost a paper of sociolinguistics applied to himself. But I thought that Goffman, besides his acute reflexivity, demonstrated that he was a very crafted lecturer performer. Well, I don't know whether in English or here in the United States, you have that very expression, conférence performance. In France, about 15 years ago, a new genre, and actually it's not that new, it's old, but it got refurbished. That is a lecturer who is also going to perform. He might dance at the same time, he might speak to the public, he might act out. And very often, these kind of lectures are going to be found in School of Arts, School of Acting, and it's probably going to be used more comfortably by people who are choreographers or artists than, let's say, university scholars. But you might also find it practiced by university persons. For example, there's a famous acting out by a scholar whose name is not going to show up, but that's all right. And he's going to act out the very way Deleuze, the French philosopher Deleuze, used to speak. So he's acting out as if he was Deleuze for an hour. So that's what we might call a conférence performance or a lecture performance. And I thought, well, it happens that as I kept grinding data, I mean, over the 34 years where I didn't write much about Goffman, I kept collecting data. And the more I collected data, the more I realized that he went all over the world, not the entire world, but in the 70s, he went in very many countries and he lectured a real lot. I also discovered that after his book called Gender Advertisement, he went out on road shows, as he called them, where he would show the pictures that appear in his book, and he would accept not to be paid if he was invited by a feminist circle or group, it was very much part of his contribution to the feminist cause to project his slides of advertisement where women are always shown as children protected by males or by their husband. And he would consider that as his civic role, so to speak. Now, it also happens that I discovered several incidents during his lectures in the world, and I'm now coming to my title. I discovered that almost by chance, someone talked to me about it, or someone said, oh, by the way, did you see that? He would kick out the photographer. And let me give you what I was able to grab, 5 incidents where Goffman, in which Goffman decided that the photographer was persona non grata. First instance, for example, we are in February 16, 1970, and he's delivering the 3 Fenton lectures at sunny Buffalo. First, and I have pictures of that because the archivist at sunny Buffalo sent me a few pictures of Goffman lecturing. And by the way, I can pass that around and you just see a few pictures. And there will be, for example, a picture of Goffman and his audience at sunny Buffalo in 1970. And it happens that a young sociologist, English sociologist, Rod Watson, was in the audience. He was a graduate at the time at sunny Buffalo. And he told me that Goffman said to the few photographers, okay, I'll let you have a few seconds to take my picture. And that's where you see the picture of Goffman standing stern, very well dressed, and he posed literally for the photographer. And then a photographer comes late and tried to sneak a photograph. Goffman had started his lecture, and he stops. He walks down the rostrum, and he goes to the photographer and says, either I lecture or I pose for photographers. I cannot do both at the same time. And he said that in such a way that the photographer panicked and dropped his camera and flash. We are in 1970, so that's still very bulky flash and camera. And he picked up his photo and left. And then Goffman went back to his rostrum and resumed his lecture. Second incident, we are at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in the mid-70s. I don't know exactly the date, but that must be the mid-70s. And it's taken here from a book called The Goffman Lectures by Tom Hood and Dwight Van der Watt, who invited Goffman. And Goffman, surprisingly enough, decided to come over and deliver a lecture every year for several years. And Tom Hood says in his book the following: near the beginning of the lecture, but before the slide of advertisement had started, a photographer for the student paper had the temerity to walk into the hall and began to take Goffman's picture without permission. All of us remember Goffman stopping his presentation and sharply dismissing the photographer from the room without a picture. So again, third incident, April 7. It's in between April 7 and April 18, 1975 at the Amsterdam Festival of Social Sciences. And I take that from a paper by Paul Brennan in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Sociology. Of course, it's a journal I read every 3 months. No, but it just happened that a friend of mine, Greg Smith, sent me the clip. And apparently Paul Brennan was so shocked that he wrote in his review of the Amsterdam Festival that Goffman stopped the show when a photographer moved to center stage. So right in the middle of a festival, he has the guts, so to speak, to say. Okay, then fourth incident, Winnipeg, May 76. And Goffman is getting a doctorate honoris causa. So it's a very formal ceremony. And the Winnipeg Free Press in May 27, 1976, reports on the deliverance of the PhD and says, Dr. Goffman, who at one point halted his speech to shoo away a photographer. So there again, the journalist is stunned to see such incident. And final incident, October 1978, Rio de Janeiro, first international symposium of the Brazilian Institute of Psychoanalysis, organized by Gilberto Velho, who was a very famous Brazilian sociologist at the time. And I guess he was a friend of Howie Becker. Becker persuaded Goffman to come over. And Velho repeated the story many times and said that a student wanted to take a picture as Goffman is talking. And Goffman, again, stopped and said it was an invasion of his privacy. And Howie Baker had to convince Goffman to resume his talk. Okay, so we see the same patterning each time in different circumstances. And now the question is, what do we do with this? What do we do with those small snapshots? Snapshots we might call biographies. You know, they are very small incidents that take only a few seconds or minutes. And there are three possibilities. Am I going to treat those incidents as illustration of a feature of Goffman's character? That would be a possibility. I could say he was oversensitive, or he was very bad-tempered, or I could also say that he was very careful to build a proper frame around his lecture so that no photographer could interrupt or break the frame, so to speak. That would be a plausible interpretation. Well, I could also say that I'm going to use those biographies as demonstration for his capacity of lecturing performing. That is, Goffman had a special knack for catching the attention of his audience in a spectacular way. I mean, suppose there was a photographer, suppose that I just said, get out of here. You will then listen to me. You know, that would be an attention grabber trick. That would be a possibility. And now, I could also say that those small pieces are only good for catching the attention of my readers. That is, I could only use them rhetorically as part of my biographical narrative. And I don't need to make much in terms of Goffman's character. I would not need to make much of those incidents for demonstrating that he was a good performer. I would then only need them as a trick for my own biographical narrative. I have to say that personally, I'm inclined to use my biographies to back up that interpretation of a Goffman as a professional lecturer performer who exactly knew what he was doing. That is, when you read his paper, the lecture, you realize, as I said before, that he was extremely sharp at looking at himself performing a lecture, which is also to say that he was probably also very acutely aware of what he was doing when he was chasing a photographer away. In a sense, Goffman then was performing his own theory of impression management. He was in control. He was not going to give up. You know, in his first book, Presentation of Self, he's going to make a distinction between what you give and what you give up. That is, when you give, if I'm here, I'm probably going to give an impression to you, but you might also look after the gestures I'm giving up. For example, now I'm getting reflexive myself, but I did that. At the very moment I did that, well, the second before I did that, I didn't know I was going to do it. So you might consider that as a given up, which might show my nervousness, my whatever. I don't think Goffman gave much off. He was in control entirely, and those throwing of the photographer away is very much part of his capacity to manage impressions. It is as if he was acting out his very theory of interactions. Now, I'm slowly moving to my pre-conclusion. Goffman, when you think about it, Goffman's biography is resting in my own hands. That is, I would say a biography is not dictated by the biography. It is written and controlled by the biographer. The interpretation I am making of Goffman's kicking out the photographers is going to shape the biography in one direction or another. And in a sense, I am giving a certain coherence to his life, but that might not be exactly the life he had. But retrospectively, using those 5 incidents and possibly the very similar incidents I might still discover later in my search for still other data, I might push the interpretation that he was very much in control and he was a very crafted lecturer. It might well be that another biographer will not do that. He might treat my 5 biographies as mere anecdotes and leave them out. So you might say that a biography is both very solid, that is, I give a coherence and I sort of pack the data in order to have a full body which sounds solid. At the same time, it is very fragile. That is, it's only, after all, my interpretation. And the next biographer might just trash it, and he will be right. And his own interpretation is going just as valid, possibly, as mine. And that does happen in many cases where biographies of the same biography are competing against each other. There are Goffman studies today, but so far as I know, there are no other biographies in the making, and I'm not competing with anybody else, but that might come true one day. And I still don't know when, but it might well happen. And it does happen for Proust of many literary writers. Speaking of which, the second conclusion I want to make is that, to me, biographies in the social sciences are still in their infancy as compared to biographies in the literary field. Not only in terms of the number of biographies of writers as compared to the number of biographies of sociologists, linguists, or anthropologists, but also in terms of the conceptual toolkit available. For example, biography comes from literary studies. And I would suggest that we, as social scientists doing biographies, we need more of those importation of cross-fertilization. And I did use a paper by Alexandre Guetin called Le Jardin d'Hiver in order to beef up my work on, or my use of the term biography. And I won't go much further, but I feel that we are far behind literary scholars in that respect of building up biographies for the history of the social sciences. The third and final conclusion I would like to draw is that interactional biographies, quote unquote, that is, biographies which are like mine, very much based on interaction between Goffman and his public, Goffman and his colleagues, are nice, but I think we need more of what I would call the contextual or historical biographies. That is, biographies framed in a larger perspective, like Gary Jaworski here wrote on Goffman in the Cold War. That is, you frame Goffman in a far wider perspective. Not to say you did not need interactions, but they were not your only tool of interpretation. You went much further back in order to see Goffman in a wider perspective. And in that respect, when we sort of zoom out, Goffman pushing photographers out of the lecture hall, you might just say, so what? It does not make much. The world outside is not waiting, we might say. In other words, I think if we want to make sense out of those small anecdotes I used tonight and try to make sense of them in a wider frame, we need to see Goffman's trajectory through a certain period of the 20th century where lectures were important events. Photographers or photographies of those events were important. There were not many other means of distributing images of those events. You might also say that audiences would come in important numbers because there were not that many possibilities for grabbing information outside of those convening or conventions, so to speak, or assembling of people listening to lecturers. So, to make a final point, it seems like Goffman lecturing and throwing those photographers away is definitely a little glimpse at a past era. And we could almost see Goffman's violent push as a farewell sign. Thank you. So now we have time, right?
Well, if I may just thank you for setting forth the roots of your work, which I've never, I don't know whether you've done this before in this manner, but I found it very insightful. Thank you. Oh, really? Oh, my. Oh, thank you. You were wonderful. I think I said something like that. I do, secondly, I really appreciate your original take on Goffman with this new book of yours on performing. Everybody else, my work included, looks at Goffman through his position in some place. Position in the Chicago School, position at Penn among sociolinguists, position in the rooting in the Cold War. Yours sets all of that aside and looks at Goffman as performing, as Goffman performing Goffman. Completely unique, completely original. Nobody else has done that, so bravo to you. I wanted to ask a question. Is it true that he not only went on a road show about gender advertisements, but that he had done so on cartoons as well? What do you know about this possibility that Goffman was also collecting cartoons and images of cartoons? Did I make that up, or
no?
Do we know
You don't make that up, but it did not go, so far as I know, on a road show. It only happened once, so far as I know. That was a conference at Davis, and I got the information through Dean McCannell, who could not remember many details, but Goffman came with a talk about, that little, cartooning game of the 7 errors. You have 2 images, and you have to find where are the 7 errors hidden, and you go back and forth between the 2 images. Sure. I just don't know what he did with that. How was he able to lecture for an hour or so about the 7 error games? I don't know. And Dean McCannell was never able to give me details about that. And the tapes of that conference disappear rather mysteriously. See, parenthesis, it's very odd that in spite of the fact that Goffman gave lectures all through the 70s, so far as I was able to track down, there are not one single film or almost photographs of his lectures. I don't know what happened to the videos. I mean, they were available in the 70s. And even the tapes sort of disappeared. Or sometimes I was told, oh yeah, well, you know, the technician made a mess out of the taping and we don't have them anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So it adds somehow to the mystery of the man in the sense that he seems to have blurred his image. And just to leave no trace, he managed to got all the videos and tapes erased and whatever.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking is on that point, so you focus in on these incidents of him throwing photographers out of the room. But I wonder about if what we can think of that as a case of something much more broadly that he did. So we also, I mean, most directly related to this, doesn't want anybody looking at his archives, doesn't want things transcribed. So when he organized his own conference, no transcriptions, no audio recordings. He told people not to audio record his lectures.
Yeah.
So we could think of also, but there might even be other seemingly more removed, but as far as the idea of always performing, I mean, I'm sure you know from some of the people you talk to, but I've heard and talked to people that were contemporaries that if he was at a dinner, he would be analyzing the dinner and say, oh, when you did that gesture right there. And so always making people feel as if at that moment, he is analyzing their impression management. And of course, then that means something about what he's trying to perform himself as the one doing the analysis of impression management. And so in that way, maybe the throwing photographers out isn't, in and of itself, isn't unique. It's part of a much broader class of behavior. And that would be consistent with everything he's doing from dinner parties to lectures to other things. One more comment that's even more meta. You got me thinking about this giving and giving off. And I was thinking, like, if we think about it in those terms, any trace of him that is not the written thing that he published, he might worry is a giving off. So even though the lecture at the time was a front stage, he doesn't want that recorded audio or visual. He doesn't want the archives because that now allows for a giving off for you to come to a different interpretation than what he wanted to be as the written word that's published. So those are, I don't know if that's really a question, but those are comments.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, because, for example, he would go to a conference and he would never give the paper for the proceedings. There again,
Right.
He would keep that under control. And it's funny because I always thought that he wanted to publish on his own and make monies out of his publications rather than giving a paper away to proceedings out of which he would not make no money. But it might also have to do with this given off personal or trait or attitude where, yeah, he's definitely in control all the time. And you are right that throwing the photographer away is also a way of erasing all possibilities. Like you're right. For example, there is a famous paper called On Field Work, which was bootleg. I mean, he didn't want any taping, and sure enough, there was one. And ultimately, that taping was transcribed and authorized by Gillian Sankoff. And now we have it, which is an interesting paper in itself. But it's just happenstantial. I mean, if the tape had run amok or, okay, got it. So, yeah, that fits within the picture, that the Goffman's personality entails the fact that he would not accept photographers. Now, there are a few exceptions, and that's also even more interesting, because, for example, in Buffalo, he accepted 2 pictures. And then he decided not to let them go, to let them take photographs of him. Or, there was a big NATO conference in '79 at Birkbeck College in London. And as it is usual in such conferences, there's a group picture at the end. And he accepted to be there. although you barely see him. I don't know whether he made it on purpose, but he turned his head away. He's talking to the person next to him, and he's in the shade, so you barely see him. You have, in a sense, you have to be there to say, look where he is. So there again, is somehow in the shade. And sure enough, the proceedings were published as a book, and it's not in there. So it confirms what you're saying.
Thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. And my question is also about like the specific incident here and the nature of like his action. Because there's one thing I'm trying to like figure out is what if that like the incident is not about the photographer, but someone else, like someone else who is not his student, but like maybe his colleague, or maybe like, because like nowadays, like in the US, because I'm also doing some teaching jobs, and sometimes you have like the teaching observation from your colleagues, like the other faculty members. And in that case, you also feel a little bit uncomfortable, like you cannot reject this. So you have to allow like your colleague like sitting in the classroom and observing your teaching. And so for me, it's also like a very strange experience. Like when I was teaching without faculty members, it's like, oh, it's just very natural. Or maybe maybe I was also doing some impression management to my students, but over time I just forgot it. Like you just feel you just teach and talk to your students. But when you have like a faculty member sitting among students, you just feel like a bit over self-conscious sometimes. And so this is my question. And another thing is about like the format of recording. Like because one explanation I have about like specific incident is that maybe he's worried about like my lecture gonna be recorded by this person. So it's not necessarily about I have a person observing me, but like my performance gonna be recorded and gonna be saved or interpreted in the future by other people. And yeah, so I just have this kind of concern.
No, very interesting contribution, because when I listen to you, I start to think about the idea, if I understood correctly what you were saying, the first question, that Goffman didn't want photographers who might be outsiders to the very community built by the public. The public was his quote unquote natural or professional or collegial community. But no one outside might just come and peekaboo, so to speak. The same way, he would not accept many students in his seminars, and certainly not just, happenstantial visitors. He wanted to build up some kind of once again, collegial group. And once you were accepted within that small community of scholars, then, as I said this morning, but I might repeat that for the audience, he would accept his quote unquote colleagues, that is graduate student, to go and look at his archives, which were in rolling cabinets, as we used to have in the 70s and all the way up to the first year of the 21st century. And when I was allowed to do that, I couldn't believe it, because as I went through the files, I would discover not intimate letters, sure enough, but still, you would see Goffman exchanging correspondence with all kinds of people. And that was, of course, of much interest to me, to the point that later some of his file cabinets were still available at the University of Pennsylvania. And I registered all the notes and letters and papers that were included in those cabinets. And then the second question was somehow related to the first, right? Same idea that Goffman didn't want any intrusion through a tape which could be used. That was somehow similar to Colin's remark about the way that nothing given off. I might add, but that's too psychologizing for me, but I still do it, that Goffman was a very, very short person, And an interpretation which is a bit sleazy or too easy is that he had to go against his very nature of a very short person. And I was told by Gillian Sankoff that he loved that song, Don't Step on Short People, by someone might tell him, no? It's a song by some American songwriter, Don't Step on Short People. And apparently that was his favorite song, or one of his favorite songs. See, then he took it humorously, but he might not have had. And maybe taping his behavior at the rostrum, not that he would come here, but still, he had to be in command. And the few photographies you saw in the book show him very much holding the rostrum and again projecting a very masterly demeanor. But he might not have had that very sense of masterly demeanor. It might have been there again, some kind of a construction. I'm just widely hypothesizing here, and I would not like to go too far in that direction because it's too psychological for my own taste. There is a colleague at the University of Las Vegas called Dmitry Shalin, who goes that way a lot, and I let him go, I would say. Apparently, he's writing a biography to be published by Routledge, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Richard.
So, two things. One is an observation, and one is more or less a question. The observation is in the book. You have a picture of Goffman at a Board Workerstein conference, and if you look at that picture, he's the only one not looking at the camera. He's looking at the others.
Yeah.
And he chose to put himself to the side. We could compare him to Turner, for example. So Turner is center and broad and
Yeah.
out there, which he always was. And Goffman's got his hands in his pockets off to the side and kind of looking, almost as if he's saying, who are these people?
Yeah, right.
So that was my experience of him too. And I don't want to psychologize either, but I think he was a little paranoid and suspicious. For those of you who don't know, I knew Erving Goffman, and I worked with him briefly. Okay, so that's the comment. But then I have a question for you. This is not really about Goffman, but it's about biography. Somewhere in your talk, you said something very provocative to me, that of literary people, we have many biographers.
Mm-hmm.
Of social, and I would add of scientists, we have many biographies also, Einstein, blah, but of social scientists, we don't. And that's kind of intriguing. I mean, I don't know that much of that literature. Is there a great biography of Durkheim, et cetera, et cetera? So the question about that is that what do biographies do? So the difference between a biography and a study is of the work. Biography is exactly about that which you want to avoid. In other words, what is the psychological and personal substance or process out of which the person emerges from. So we read in biography, you want to read somebody's letters because you want to know their intimate life. You want to know what they're saying in their unguarded moments, et cetera, and so forth. It would seem to me to be Goffman as a person is someone who's very, very careful to not let official people know his unguarded moments. He obviously had unguarded moments, and he could be very delightful in personal interactions. He could be intimate in his house at Rittenhouse Square. And when we co-taught, he and I co-taught, as you know, I mean, the others of you in the room don't, but we had a seminar together. And Goffman wasn't there for the whole of it. He was there for part of it. He could be very funny and ironic and all of that. But I think that when he moved into the public arena, he would not want to be a subject of a biography. and that almost, in other words, I don't think he would think that would build his mythology. I just think he would say, I've written these books, isn't that enough? And yet you're talking about when we do biographies of literary figures, you want to know, you want to know everything there is about Dostoevsky that would make him write the Brothers Karamazov, for example. So you really want to dig in to that which is not in the book, but which gives rise to the book. So I'd like you to talk about that in relationship not only to Goffman, but to social sciences. Do anthropologists want to be explained in that way? Or when one chooses, you see what you see what I'm driving at?
Yeah.
Okay.
I say, if I understand it correctly, that there might be more of a direct link between a literary writer, and his literary work than there may be between, let's say, an anthropologist and his work.
Right. Yes.
Why is that so? There are a few biographies. I mean, there are biographies of Margaret Mead, there are biographies of Gregory Bateson, Clifford Geertz, a few major figures, but it stops there. While for just about every writer I know, there is a biographer, and there is that tentative link between the person and the work, and also there are plenty of work of is there a link between the writer's life and the work. I mean, it goes back to Sainte-Beuve, and then there was a controversy up to this very day with books by Gisèle Sapiro for the French public about the relationship between I'm looking at François for that because probably did literature better than I do. It is as if fictional writing was considered as fed more systematically by one's life than it is the case for anthropologists or sociologists who are supposed to write books which are outside of their personal realm. Although when you start scrutinizing, you realize that the relationship between their supposedly external work and their life, that link is probably shorter or thicker than you might usually consider. But that hasn't been, so far as I know, systematically investigated. We take for granted that that there's not that much of a link, so it's not that much of interest to know why Geertz went to Bali and to Morocco and blah, blah, blah.
But what you're saying is absolutely true in relationship to Goffman in the sense that if there's a theme that runs through his work, scholarly work, it's about how you control impression management. What stigmatizes you, what rituals, there are kind of basic themes, and therefore his not wanting photographers is almost a way of saying, I don't want to be discovered in that way.
And what I have been trying to do in my biographical pieces is to say that actually, even though Goffman did not disclose much personally of his own life, his own work is a way of reading his life. Yeah. And he has been feeding much of his own life into his work, no matter how he denied it. I just don't know for other social scientists. I only did biographical work on Goffman, but I would bet that such similar links could be discovered. And that's a way of doing work in the social sciences. And that's actually, it's part of the work which I did with, now I have to find out the name. There is an author who was here at, I think, CUNY, and he wrote a book trying to say that Freud, for example, threw his life into his psychoanalysis because he was trying to explain what was happening to himself as a Jew jumping into the secular world of Vienna first. Cudi, his name is. You might know Cudahy, or you might have known him, right?
The book came out in the 70s, so.
Yeah, right. And when I discovered that book, I thought, gee, that sounds very much like Goffman projecting his life and experiences into his work, and Cudahy saying that there are people who actually write a theory in order to explain their own life to themselves.
Right.
And I once called Cudahy, and he said that his book was not well received and had little critical receptions. And when I used that very hypothesis in my first book called The Moment et leurs hommes, I submitted it to University of Pennsylvania Press for translation and publication. And I was told that my interpretation based on Cudahy was, quote unquote, grating to the Jews. And I should not use that frame of interpretation. All right, fine. And Bourdieu had warned me not to do that either. Surprisingly, they said, don't tread. It's too dangerous. Okay. So actually, I pulled out of that interpretation later. And it's true that if the interpretation is too causal, that is, that someone's work is always autobiographical in some respect.
Right.
That's possibly too risky. And it's true that Cudahy's book is very hypothetical. And in that respect, it's very fragile because he tries to show that not only Freud, but also Durkheim, but also Levi-Strauss are also very personal in their way of handling the Gentile word as I arrive into it and have to grasp it. I never met Cudahy. I don't know what kind of guy he was and whether he made other books, similar books. I just don't know. But I just mentioned that because he tried to make a personal link there, and it didn't. It ran sort of not amok, but it ran a fool. It didn't work that very well. So I have been trying to stay away from that kind of interpretation also. But you're right that there is more to be investigated in that respect for the social sciences, as it has been for the literary field. And speaking of the literary field, maybe
I'm not sure that I'm a specialist of literary field, but well, I would like you to well, first, thank you for your amazing lecture. I would like you to say something about biographies today as a genre. From a sociological perspective, because, well, you refer to the 70s, the famous text by Bourdieu, and all this disdain against of biographies, of the genre of biography, and also the attempt to find new forms, like, you know, Roland Barthes, par Roland Barthes, you know, the biographies, but also Derrida with George Pennington, and finally Bourdieu himself with this essay d'auto-analyse, you know. But well, that was this moment is over, completely over, and biography as a genre, you know, today is so fashion, so claimed, you know, it came back. So could you say something? Do you have an explanation for this comeback? Or I don't know if it's a comeback or if the biographies are not the same than before the 70s, but it's striking that even now, you know, you have scholars writing very traditional biographies of these thinkers who, you know, contest, who didn't want to have kind of biographies, you know, that are now big biographies of Roland Barthes, a biography of Derrida by Peters, and Bourdieu by Sapiro. So it's but anyway, it's not to say something against this, just to understand this comeback.
It seems like you just said the word traditional. It is as if recent biographies were very traditional as compared to the exercises that were made in the 70s or 80s. I mean, Roland Barthes was a very daring exercise. And there are other biographical or autobiographical explorations which were much more experimental and intellectually interesting. It seems like biographies in the social sciences today are just jumping into, and very often they are invited by publishers, and they're just jumping in a very wide stream of biographies of just about everybody. It's a publishing genre that seems to be selling very well. It also possibly has to do with a genre which is just next to it. It is the biographies of unknown people, life histories. I mean, for example, Philippe Lejeune has been pushing for the collecting of thousands of biographies by unknown people, saying that they are worth collecting and treating. But there is also, it happens that I was at Cerisy, I mean, it's a castle in Normandy, where conferences happen every summer on different themes, organized by academics most of the time, who submit their theme to the owner of the castle, who says yes or no. And there are about 15 one-week-long conferences every summer. And there was one of those conferences on life histories in the mental health field, that is, or the health field, not mental specifically, but how telling one's life, publishing it or not, but sometimes there's even private publishing now. Technologically, it's very easy to do. And it's supposed to be helping you going through your crisis, going through your cancer, going possibly through your palliative period before your death. There is now even a degree at some Swiss university for accompagning, it's called accompagnateur de récit de vie, accompagner of life histories. And they usually work in hospitals in order to collect biographies of people who are possibly soon to die, but who wants to live, to their descendants, an heritage under the form of a biography. So biography is really becoming a huge genre. On the one hand, you have very well-known people, but right under, you have unknown people who also contribute to their own biography. And they may well read biographies of more famous people than themselves, but in a sense, they might feel they're in the same boat. You know, it also said that by, what's her name? She's an American social scientist. Her name might come back to me, but she says, writing one's life is putting a coherence into your life. That is, as you are able to reconstruct your life, you make it better organized than it happened to be. But it gives you a nice feeling of time finally not that wasted once you are able to make plausible relationship between different decisions you took over the years. And if you have a professional accompaniment, it's even better because you end up sometimes with a book that you can give to your children, or you can publish it in 15 copies and pass it around. But see, it's really, in terms of those floating biographies, we are now at a time when there are very many biographies, but they're very traditionally organized. I mean, the narrative is strictly chronological. And it's not, as I was trying to do, bits and pieces and trying to trigger what we might even call in cinematographic terms, Kuleshov effect, between one little piece here and one little piece there, and then the reader is to fill the blank. That's how I felt. I felt that I did not need to make very explicitly causal links, so long I had two snapshots then the reader would fill it out, and that would be, in terms of progressing through the narrative, a more effective way of proceeding. But that's not the way people do. It's really, and then, and then, and then. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Question from an online audience. Taylor Price says, I think your point is fair that throwing out the photographer contributes to framing the lecture as a serious academic endeavor. I wonder whether this was his primary concern or if it was a result of managing how he was presented in a media context. He would have no control over the composition of the photo, how his face would look exactly, etc. Perhaps he was managing his presentation of self in the media context, less so than in the lecture context. Have you considered this alternative explanation? I feel like my question is in line with Professor Jeromack's comment.
Yeah, I think the comment here fits very well what we have been saying together. That is how he was very much in control. I don't think he was very much aware or very sensitive to the media. He hated, basically, media for different reasons, which might be related to the way he was treated at some point by the media, especially when his first wife committed suicide. There are clipping from the San Francisco newspapers, which are quite stunning in their invasion of privacy. And with a colleague of mine, Greg Smith, with whom I'm trying to resume writing a full-fledged biography, we are trying to suggest that from that very moment, he thought that he was just thrown in the public scene through with newspapers. No way he was going to let himself be available to mass media. And the photographers in that respect might be one of these ways to shoo away the media who might have come up. Note that the photographers he threw away were sometimes just a student newspaper representative. In some other cases, it was an official photographer for the university or for a local media. But so far as I know, there was never a major newspaper sending a photographer who got kicked out. But it just happenstance. He might not have been that publicly well known to the point that a national newspaper would have sent a photographer to take a photograph before the lecture. But our correspondent is right that he was very unsecure with mass media. He didn't go into public interviews. There is only one indirect interview by some London newspaper when he became president of the American Sociological Association, and very reluctantly he accepted to be interviewed, but he would not accept to be quoted directly. So the journalist had to say, Goffman told me that, instead of Goffman, quote unquote. So there again, let's try to retreat. Let's try not to be on front. Well, yeah, let's do that. The best lecture is the shortest, right? Okay, thank you very much for the technology.